The battle against Frieza had reached its breaking point. Gohan and Krillin were exhausted. Vegeta was barely standing, and Goku was still recovering from the injuries he had suffered before the battle. Meanwhile, Frieza had already transformed into his second form, and the difference in power was becoming impossible to overcome. The heroes had fought as hard as they could, but against Frieza, it simply wasn't enough. Then, something happened that nobody expected. Piccolo got brought to Namek. After fusing with Nail, Piccolo had already become strong enough to challenge Frieza's earlier forms, but after doing so, he figured out something. There were still Namekians alive, and if one fusion could make him this powerful, what would happen if every surviving Namekian fused with him? Piccolo looked across the battlefield. The Namekians had lost almost everything. Their villages had to be destroyed, their people had been murdered, and Frieza was still standing. Piccolo approached the surviving Namekians. He explained what he had to do. At first, they hesitated. Fusion meant giving up their individual lives, but they understood what was at stake. If Frieza won, none of them would have a future anyway, and trusting the warrior accepted by Nail at least gave them hope. One by one, they agreed. The elders stepped forward first, then the warriors, and finally, the remaining villagers. Piccolo stood at the center of them all. The first Namekian placed his hand against Piccolo. There was a flash of light before he disappeared, and Piccolo's power increased. Then another and another. The process continued. Dozens of Namekians became one. Their memories, experiences, knowledge and power all flowed into Piccolo. It became something much greater than their individual parts. Piccolo wasn't becoming a different person or losing himself. He was simply becoming something far greater. Then, the final Namekian approached. Piccolo looked at him, and the Namekian smiled. "Protect our home." Piccolo nodded. Then they fused. A massive explosion of energy erupted across the battlefield. When the light disappeared, Piccolo was standing there. But it wasn't the Piccolo everyone knew before. His muscles were larger, his aura was immense, and even beneath all the raw power, he could feel something different. He has the collective knowledge and potential of an entire race. With time, he could master magical powers that would far surpass the heights of any Namekian in history. But for now, what mattered was strength. His power was so overwhelming that even Vegeta couldn't comprehend it. Gohan stared as he saw his mentor approach, and Krillin could barely speak. Finally Frieza, despite not instantly, for the first time, looked nervous upon seeing Piccolo. Piccolo simply looked at Frieza. Now, he clenched his fists. "We fight." Frieza immediately attacked. A death beam shot toward Piccolo's head, but the Namekian didn't move. The beam struck him and disappeared. Piccolo hadn't even raised his hands. Frieza's eyes widened, and then Piccolo vanished. A split second later, his fist slammed into Frieza's stomach. The impact sent the Emperor flying, crashing to a mountain. Before he could recover, Piccolo was already there. Another punch, then another, then a kick. Finally, Frieza was hundreds of meters into the air. Everything in his body hurt, feeling the immense power of Piccolo. He looked down at his body. He was bleeding. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was Frieza, one of the most powerful beings in the universe, and yet he was being dominated by a green slug. Enraged, he skipped the third form and went directly to his final. Frieza fires dozens of death beams. Piccolo moves through them effortlessly. He appears directly in front of Frieza and grabbed him by the face. Frieza struggled, but Piccolo didn't even move. He simply threw him into the ground and the entire planet shook. Vegeta was still awestruck. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. These bastards. Piccolo had surpassed him. Not by a little, but by an absurd, unquantifiable amount. Frieza finally decided to stop holding back. His aura exploded and he went to 100%. But Piccolo didn't even react. Even as Frieza charged and punched him with all he had, Piccolo didn't move. The shockwave spread across the battlefield. And yet, nothing happened before Piccolo countered with a strike much more powerful that sent Frieza flying across the planet. Frieza recovered and immediately launched a massive energy attack. Piccolo simply raised his hands. A green barrier appeared around him. The blast exploded against it, and when the smoke cleared, Piccolo was still standing, completely unharmed. Frieza's expression changed. Piccolo raised 2 fingers this time. A familiar energy began forming. But this wasn't the special beam can that Piccolo had used before. No, it was a version much more powerful and much faster to prepare. It grew and kept growing, until Piccolo fired it. The massive beam tore through the battlefield, and Frieza barely managed to dodge it. The attack continued into the distance, carving through mountains and disappearing beyond the horizon. Frieza stared at Piccolo. "You're finished." Frieza's anger had reached its limits. He gathered an enormous amount of energy. A gigantic death ball formed above him. The sky darkened, the entire battlefield was illuminated by its glow. Frieza threw it toward Piccolo, but the Namekian didn't even move. The death ball descended, and he just raised one hand. He stopped it. The enormous sphere hovered above his palm. Frieza stared at him in disbelief. There was no way this could be happening. Piccolo simply pushed his arm forward. The death ball began moving back toward Frieza. Frieza screamed, trying to overpower it, but Piccolo simply pushed harder. The death ball was launched into the sky, and Frieza watched helplessly as his own attack disappeared into space. Then Piccolo turned toward him and disappeared, appearing in front of Frieza and punching him, sending him crashing to the ground. Piccolo landed in front of him, and when Frieza lifted his head, for the first time, he knew he couldn't win. Then a familiar voice came from behind Piccolo. It was Goku. Piccolo turned and saw his friends finally standing. He had recovered, and he could feel Piccolo's power. It was enormous, far beyond anything he had sensed before. Goku smiled. Looks like he took care of things. Piccolo looked at him, then at Frieza. Not yet. Frieza tries to rise from the crater, battered, bleeding, but he was still alive. He screamed and unleashed everything he had, but Piccolo still didn't move. He took punches, kicks, death beams, energy blasts. Nothing worked. He simply walked through the attacks, then grabbed Frieza. "Now you're finished." Piccolo raised his hand. A massive sphere of energy gathered above his palm. Frieza's eyes widened, and Piccolo fired. The blast engulfed Frieza completely. For several seconds, the battlefield disappeared beneath the light. Then it was over, and Frieza was gone. The battlefield became silent, and Piccolo stood alone. The Namekians had sacrificed their individual lives, but their people had survived. Piccolo carried them all within him. Their memories, knowledge, will, and strength. He wasn't simply Piccolo anymore. He was the culmination of an entire race. The ultimate Namekian. And because of him, the Emperor of the Universe had finally been defeated. Not by a Saiyan, not by a legendary transformation, but by Namek itself. But defeating Frieza was only the beginning, because Piccolo's existence changed the entire future. With Frieza gone, the heroes eventually returned to Earth, and Piccolo was on an entirely different level. There was no longer no reason for him to be on the sidelines. He trained constantly, and so did the others. After seeing what Piccolo had accomplished on Namek, Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan, and the rest of the Z Fighters had an entirely different standard to chase. A few years later, the androids came. In the original timeline, they were one of the greatest threats Earth had ever faced, but here, they never got close. Piccolo sensed them almost immediately, and when they attacked, he dealt with them effortlessly. The difference in power was simply too large. The same with Cell, but his story ended even faster. Piccolo was able to track him down before he could absorb anyone, and reach his perfect form. He never got even close to his full potential. He was simply vaporized by the ultimate Namekian. For the first time, the Z Fighters weren't straining to catch up with the enemy anymore. They were by far the strongest warriors in the universe, as they kept getting stronger by training with Piccolo. Years later, Majin Buu arrived, and even he couldn't completely overwhelm the Earth's defenders. Yet, the battle was still dangerous. Buu's regeneration and strange abilities made him difficult to deal with. But the Z Fighters had far surpassed their canon timeline's limits. They had spent years training under Piccolo's shadow after all. Eventually, they defeated Buu. Earth had survived. Years later, Piccolo was still the ultimate Namekian. Because of the enormous latent potential he got from absorbing all Namekians, he learned new magic abilities, and obtained his orange form much earlier than in the original story. When Beerus arrived, the Z Fighters thought they had already seen everything, but they're wrong. Beerus wasn't like Freeza, like Cell, or like Buu. He was on an entirely different level, and for the first time, Piccolo simply wasn't enough to overwhelm his opponents. Neither were Goku or anyone else, but still they did their best and managed to impress the God of Destruction. From here on out, the story closely followed the original one, with the Z Warriors taking the Godwin training and surpassing their limits. However, this time, Piccolo stood at the pinnacle of mortal power. If you enjoyed this story, please give a like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. And if you're interested in watching any other What If videos, I have two cool ones appearing on the screen right now.